28th of April, 1996. A Sunday morning dawned clear and mild over Tasmania's Tasman Peninsula, the kind of autumn day that promises nothing but tranquility. Port Arthur Historic Site, a sprawling collection of convict-era ruins nestled between eucalyptus forests and the impossibly blue waters of Mason Cove, was preparing for what seemed like an ordinary day. Families from Hobart had made the 90-minute drive south. Tourists from interstate and overseas wandered through the Broad Arrow Café, ordering scones and coffee, planning their afternoon tours of the old penitentiary buildings. Children chased each other across the manicured lawns. By midday, more than 500 visitors had passed through the gates. None of them knew they were walking into the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history. Martin Bryant was 28 years old that morning. To those who knew him casually, he was odd, awkward, a man-child who'd inherited a fortune after the death of a wealthy benefactor and had never quite learned how to exist in the world. He had an intellectual disability, an IQ measured at 66, and a history of erratic behavior that had made him a figure of unease in his small community near Newtown. But there was something else beneath the surface, something darker that psychiatrists would later struggle to name. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships. His days were spent driving aimlessly in his yellow Volvo, visiting historical sites, buying and collecting guns. In the weeks before that Sunday, Brian had acquired an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and an L1A1 SLR, weapons designed for war, not sport. He'd told no one what he intended to do with them. The morning of the 28th began for Bryant like so many others. He left his home in the Hobart suburb of Newtown driving his Volvo, but this time he carried a sports bag in the back seat. Inside were the rifles, magazines, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He drove south toward Port Arthur, stopping briefly at a service station where he bought a cigarette lighter. It was a detail that would matter later. Around 10:30, he arrived at a bed and breakfast in the small settlement of Seascape, just a few kilometers from the historic site. The owners, David and Nolene Martin, a middle-aged couple who had recently purchased the property, were inside. Bryant had a history with this place, a grievance that had festered. His benefactor had once tried to buy the guesthouse and failed. Minutes after arriving, Martin Bryant shot both David and Nolene Martin dead. Their bodies would not be discovered for hours. By 12:30 in the afternoon, Bryant had driven the short distance to Port Arthur itself. He parked his Volvo in the coach park, took his sports bag, and walked toward the Broad Arrow Café. It was lunchtime. The café was crowded, packed with tourists sitting at tables, waiting in line for sandwiches and hot drinks. Families, elderly couples, a woman celebrating her 50th birthday. Bryant entered through the main door, ordered a meal, and sat down at a table near the windows overlooking the water. He ate slowly, methodically. Then, at approximately 1:30 p.m., he stood up, reached into his bag, and pulled out the AR-15. What happened next unfolded in seconds but would scar a nation for generations. Bryant began firing with lethal precision. The first shot struck a man and a woman at a nearby table. Then he turned, sweeping the weapon across the crowded room, pulling the trigger again and again. People screamed, dove under tables, tried to run for the exits. But there was nowhere to go. The café's narrow doorways became bottlenecks of panic. Within 90 seconds, 12 people lay dead inside the Broad Arrow Café. Another 10 were wounded, bleeding on the floor among overturned chairs and shattered glass. Bryant moved with chilling calm, reloading as he walked, stepping over bodies, continuing to fire. He exited the café and walked into the car park, still shooting. A woman and her 2 young daughters, cowering behind a tree, were killed where they stood. A couple attempting to drive away were shot through their windscreen. The historic site, moments ago a place of leisure and learning, had become an abattoir. And Martin Bryant, his face expressionless, kept moving, kept firing, as smoke drifted from the barrel of his rifle and the screams of the dying echoed across the sandstone ruins. Bryant moved through the grounds like a predator in a shooting gallery. By 1:35 p.m., he had killed 20 people. The air was thick with gunpowder and terror. Visitors who had been strolling through the penitentiary ruins moments earlier now sprinted toward the water's edge, toward the bush, anywhere that might offer cover. Some hid inside the old convict buildings, pressing themselves against cold stone walls, praying the footsteps outside would pass. Others lay motionless among the dead, hoping the gunman would think them already gone. But Bryant wasn't finished. He returned to his yellow Volvo, placed the AR-15 in the back seat, and drove out of the historic site. The killing spree was moving. At the toll booth near the exit, he encountered a woman working the gate. He shot her through the window of her booth. She slumped forward, blood spreading across her uniform. Bryant continued driving north along the Arthur Highway, the main road connecting Port Arthur to the rest of Tasmania. Within minutes, he encountered a gold-colored BMW sedan coming in the opposite direction. Inside were Glenn Pears, a local man, and his girlfriend Zoe Hall. Bryant forced the BMW off the road, shot Glenn Pears multiple times, and seized Hall, forcing her into the boot of the BMW. He abandoned his Volvo there on the roadside and took the BMW, driving back toward Seascape, the guesthouse where his day of violence had begun. Police radios across Tasmania erupted with frantic transmissions. Reports of multiple shootings at Port Arthur. Casualties in the dozens. An active gunman on the loose. But this was Tasmania in 1996, a place where serious violent crime was almost unheard of. The police force was small, under-equipped, and utterly unprepared for what they were about to face. The Special Operations Group, Tasmania's elite tactical unit, was based in Hobart, more than an hour's drive away. Local officers raced toward Port Arthur with standard-issue revolvers and shotguns, knowing they were outgunned, knowing people were dying, knowing they had no choice but to respond. By 2:15 p.m., Bryant had barricaded himself inside the Seascape guesthouse with Zoe Hall as his hostage. The bodies of David and Nolene Martin still lay inside where he had left them that morning. He set fire to the BMW in the driveway, a signal, a statement, or perhaps just chaos for its own sake. Black smoke billowed into the clear autumn sky. When the first police officers arrived at the property, they found themselves pinned down by rifle fire from the upper windows of the guesthouse. Bryant was now engaged in a standoff, and he had nothing left to lose. Back at Port Arthur, the scene was apocalyptic. Emergency services flooded the historic site. Ambulances lined the car park, their doors flung open, paramedics working frantically to triage the wounded. The Broad Arrow Café had become a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Bodies remained where they had fallen, some still seated at tables, others sprawled across the floor in pools of blood. Survivors wandered in shock, covered in the blood of strangers, unable to process what had just happened. Helicopters circled overhead. Television news crews, alerted by police scanners, began arriving from Hobart. Within hours, the images would be broadcast across Australia and then around the world. Inside the Seascape guesthouse, Bryant held his position as darkness fell. Police surrounded the property, establishing a perimeter, calling in negotiators, waiting for the Special Operations Group to arrive with the firepower and training necessary to end this. But Bryant refused to negotiate. He fired sporadically from the windows, forcing officers to take cover behind their vehicles. Hours dragged into night. Searchlights illuminated the property. The entire nation was now watching, glued to their television screens, trying to comprehend how something like this could happen in Australia, a country that prided itself on safety, on distance from the gun violence that plagued other parts of the world. At some point during the long night, Zoe Hall died. Whether Bryant killed her or whether she succumbed to injuries sustained earlier remained unclear. He was alone now in that house with 3 bodies and his arsenal. The standoff continued through the night and into the early hours of Monday morning. Police could do nothing but wait, monitor, and prepare for the moment Bryant either surrendered or forced their hand. Then, at approximately 8:15 a.m. on the 29th of April, more than 18 hours after the siege began, smoke began pouring from the windows of Seascape. Bryant had set the guesthouse on fire. Flames consumed the wooden structure rapidly. The roof collapsed inward, sending sparks spiraling into the morning sky. And then, through the smoke and chaos, a figure emerged from the burning building. Martin Bryant, his clothes singed and smoking, stumbled into the driveway with severe burns across his back and limbs. Police rushed forward, tackled him to the ground, and placed him under arrest. The siege was over. The shooting had stopped. But the toll was almost incomprehensible. 35 people were dead. 23 others were wounded, some permanently disabled, all permanently scarred. And an entire nation was left to grapple with a single devastating question. How do we make sure this never happens again? The investigation began even as the fires at Seascape still smoldered. Tasmania police, working alongside Australian federal police and forensic experts flown in from the mainland, faced a crime scene unlike anything in the nation's history. Port Arthur Historic Site remained closed, cordoned off with police tape that stretched across acres of blood-stained ground. Inside the Broad Arrow Café, investigators worked in rotating shifts, documenting every bullet hole, every shell casing, every position where a body had fallen. The forensic photography alone took days. Each image captured the randomness of the violence, the way Bryant had fired indiscriminately into crowds of people whose only mistake had been choosing that particular Sunday for an outing. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics experts matched the spent cartridges found at Port Arthur to the AR-15 and SLR rifle recovered from the burned remains of Seascape. Witnesses, traumatized but determined to help, provided statements describing a young man with long blonde hair, carrying a large sports bag, firing methodically and without apparent emotion. Survivors who had played dead beneath tables in the cafe recounted hearing Bryant's footsteps, hearing him reload, hearing the crack of each new shot. Security footage from the historic site captured his Volvo entering the car park. The toll booth camera showed him moments after killing the attendant. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction, and that direction was Martin Bryant. But understanding what Bryant had done was simpler than understanding why. Detectives combing through his background found a young man who had lived on the margins of society for his entire life. Born in 1967, Bryant had shown signs of developmental problems from early childhood. He'd been disruptive in school, unable to form friendships, prone to violent outbursts. Psychological assessments conducted when he was a teenager noted his low IQ and suggested he might never be capable of independent living. Yet he had lived independently, or at least unsupervised, for years. In 1992, his father, who had struggled to manage his son's behavior, died by suicide. 2 years later, Helen Harvey, an eccentric heiress who had befriended Bryant and left him a substantial inheritance when she died in a car accident, provided him with the financial means to live without working, without structure, without oversight. Investigators discovered that Bryant had spent the inheritance on cars, trips, and guns. Lots of guns. In the months before the massacre, he had legally purchased high-powered semi-automatic weapons from licensed dealers who saw nothing in his demeanor that raised alarms. Australia's gun laws in 1996 were a patchwork of state-based regulations, inconsistent and full of loopholes. In Tasmania, particularly, gun ownership was common, culturally embedded, and lightly regulated. Bryant had exploited that system, amassing an arsenal that included military-grade weapons designed to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. The question that haunted investigators was whether anyone could have stopped him, whether any warning signs had been visible before he loaded those weapons into his Volvo and drove south. Psychiatrists brought in to assess Bryant after his arrest faced their own challenges. He was burned, hospitalized under heavy guard, and largely uncommunicative. When he did speak, his statements were rambling, disconnected, sometimes childlike. He showed little apparent understanding of the magnitude of what he had done. During one interview, he asked whether the police would give him back his car. During another, he complained about the food in the hospital. Experts diagnosed him with a range of possible conditions, from intellectual disability to schizophrenia to personality disorders that defied easy categorization. But none of that explained the meticulous planning evident in his actions. He had brought multiple weapons, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and had executed his attack with a level of efficiency that suggested forethought, even if the motive remained opaque. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and, in many ways, inevitable. Bryant was charged with 35 counts of murder and numerous counts of attempted murder, wounding, and other offenses. His lawyers, appointed by the court, faced an impossible task. The evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses were numerous and consistent. There was no question of mistaken identity, no alternative suspect, no plausible defense. The only question was whether Bryant would plead guilty or force the survivors and families of the victims to endure a trial. For weeks, as Bryant recovered from his burns in a secure hospital ward, his legal team negotiated with prosecutors. The families waited, dreading the possibility of having to relive the massacre in open court, of seeing photographs of their loved ones displayed as evidence, of hearing Bryant's lawyers argue for leniency. On the 7th of November, 1996, more than 6 months after the massacre, Martin Bryant appeared in the Supreme Court of Tasmania in Hobart. The courtroom was packed with survivors, families, journalists, and members of the public desperate to witness justice. Bryant, his hair cut short, wearing a suit that seemed too large for his frame, sat in the dock flanked by security officers. When the charges were read aloud, all 72 of them, he responded in a flat, emotionless voice. Guilty. Guilty to 35 counts of murder. Guilty to every charge. There would be no trial. No defense. No attempt to explain or justify what he had done. Justice William Cox, presiding over the case, delivered a sentence that reflected the enormity of the crime. 35 life sentences, one for each person killed, to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole. Bryant would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, isolated from society, denied any chance of release. It was the harshest sentence in Australian legal history, and it was met with silence in the courtroom. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of closure. The victims were still dead. The survivors were still broken. And the nation was still reeling. But even as Bryant was led away to begin his sentence at Risdon Prison in Hobart, the real reckoning was only beginning. Within days of the massacre, while the bodies were still being identified, the Australian government had begun discussing what would become the most comprehensive gun reform in the nation's history. Prime Minister John Howard, newly elected and facing enormous political pressure, stood before the country and declared that Australia would never allow such a tragedy to happen again. The question was no longer whether gun laws would change, but how radically, how quickly, and whether the political will existed to overcome decades of entrenched gun culture. 12 days after the massacre, Prime Minister John Howard stood before a crowd of nearly 3,000 people in the Melbourne Town Hall wearing a bulletproof vest beneath his suit. The audience was hostile, overwhelmingly so. They were gun owners, members of shooting clubs, rural Australians who had driven hours to protest what they saw as government overreach. They booed, they heckled, they held signs accusing Howard of tyranny. But he stood at that podium anyway, flanked by security, and announced that his government would introduce the most sweeping gun control legislation Australia had ever seen. The political risk was immense. Howard's Liberal National Coalition drew much of its support from rural and regional areas where gun ownership was woven into daily life, where farmers used rifles to manage livestock and control pests, where shooting was not just a hobby but a heritage. Yet Howard had made a calculation. Port Arthur had changed everything, and Australians, even those who loved their guns, were horrified enough to accept change. The National Firearms Agreement, negotiated between the federal government and all 6 states and 2 territories, was unveiled in May 1996, barely 2 weeks after the massacre. The reforms were comprehensive and uncompromising. All semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns and rifles were banned outright for civilian ownership. A national firearms registry was established, requiring every gun in the country to be documented. Licensing became standardized and rigorous, demanding background checks, safety training, and a demonstrated genuine reason for ownership. Self-defense was explicitly excluded as a valid reason. Guns would no longer be treated as rights but as privileges, granted only to those who could prove a legitimate need. The laws applied uniformly across the nation, closing the loopholes that had allowed someone like Martin Bryant to legally purchase military-grade weapons without scrutiny. But the most controversial element of the reforms was the mandatory buyback program. The government allocated $500 million Australian dollars to purchase and destroy the newly prohibited weapons. Gun owners were given 12 months to surrender their firearms to police in exchange for fair market compensation. The program was not optional. Possession of a banned weapon after the deadline would become a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. For many Australians, particularly in rural communities, this felt like confiscation, an assault on their way of life. Protest rallies erupted across the country. Gun lobby groups launched legal challenges, arguing that the federal government had overstepped its constitutional authority. Talk radio programs lit up with callers predicting that disarming law-abiding citizens would lead to skyrocketing crime rates, home invasions, and government tyranny. Yet despite the fury, despite the protests and the dire predictions, the buyback proceeded. Over the following months, more than 640,000 firearms were surrendered and destroyed. Police stations across Australia set up collection points where owners lined up, some reluctantly, some angrily, to hand over weapons that had been in their families for generations. The guns were catalogued, their serial numbers recorded, and then they were crushed, melted down, rendered into scrap metal. Images of massive piles of rifles and shotguns being fed into industrial shredders were broadcast on evening news programs. For supporters of the reforms, these images represented progress, a nation choosing safety over ideology. For opponents, they were symbols of loss, of a government trampling individual freedoms in the name of collective security. The political cost was real. Howard's coalition lost seats in regional areas during subsequent elections. Some members of his own party publicly criticized the reforms. The gun lobby remained vocal and bitter, predicting that the laws would be ineffective, that criminals would still find ways to obtain weapons, that Australians had sacrificed liberty for an illusion of safety. But then something remarkable happened. The predictions of chaos never materialized. Crime rates did not spike. Home invasions did not surge. Instead, in the years and decades that followed Port Arthur, Australia experienced a dramatic decline in gun-related deaths. Mass shootings, which had occurred with tragic regularity in the years before 1996, virtually disappeared. Between 1979 and 1996, Australia had experienced 13 mass shootings. In the 28 years after Port Arthur, there have been 0 mass shootings of comparable scale using firearms. The data was unambiguous, and over time, even many former critics of the laws came to accept that the reforms had worked. The families of those killed at Port Arthur became reluctant advocates for gun control, their grief transforming into purpose. Carolyn Loughton, who survived the massacre but lost her 15-year-old daughter Sarah, spoke publicly about the need for nations to learn from Australia's experience. Walter Mycak, who lost his wife Nanette and their 2 young daughters Alana and Madeline in the cafe, established a foundation dedicated to preventing gun violence and supporting victims of trauma. These voices, born from unimaginable loss, gave the reforms a human face, a moral weight that transcended political ideology. They reminded Australians that behind every statistic, every gun surrendered, every law passed, were real people whose lives had been shattered by one man's access to weapons designed for mass killing. Martin Bryant remains in prison to this day, housed in a secure psychiatric facility within Risdon Prison. He is now in his 50s, serving his 35 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He has never expressed remorse. He has never provided a coherent explanation for why he committed the massacre. Psychiatrists who have assessed him over the years describe a man whose intellectual and emotional limitations make it unlikely he will ever fully comprehend the scale of his actions. He exists in isolation, a ghost of that Sunday in April, alive but removed from the world he devastated. Port Arthur Historic Site reopened to visitors in November 1996, 7 months after the massacre. The Broad Arrow Café was never rebuilt. In its place stands a memorial garden, a reflection pool surrounded by stone plaques bearing the names of the 35 people who died. Visitors walk through in silence, reading the names, pausing to place flowers, struggling to reconcile the beauty of the location with the horror of what happened there. The site has become a place of pilgrimage, not just for Australians but for people around the world who come to bear witness, to remember, and to reflect on what was lost and what was learned. The Port Arthur massacre forced Australia to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, about gun culture, about the fragility of safety in a modern society. It shattered the illusion that mass violence was something that only happened elsewhere, in other countries with different values. And in the aftermath, Australia made a choice. It was a difficult choice, a politically costly choice, but it was a choice rooted in the belief that no one should ever again walk into a cafe on a Sunday afternoon and face what those people faced. 28 years later, the legacy of Port Arthur is not just the lives lost, but the lives saved by a nation willing to act when action was most needed. The ghosts of that April day still linger in the ruins and gardens of Port Arthur, but they have also become a reminder that tragedy, however profound, does not have to define a nation's future. Australia chose a different path, and it has made all the difference.